Togo is on fire. A nation's democracy has been turned into a dynasty, and its people are rising. But how did one man rewrite the rules and steal the future of an entire country? Join us as we uncover the story of how President Nasingbé transformed Togo into Africa's last great dynasty, triggering a revolution in the heart of the country. This is the story of defiance, betrayal, and an unyielding fight for freedom. It all started with a single, quiet oath on June 24, 2025. Behind closed doors, a man whose name had already become synonymous with power in Togo stood before a restructured parliament and took an oath, but not as the president of the country. No, this time, it was as the head of the newly created Council of Ministers. To the public, this was a title unfamiliar, yet powerful enough to reshape the political landscape of Togo. There were no rallies, no speeches to the people, no votes, just a few lines of ink on paper, quickly passed by lawmakers loyal to the ruling party, a legal maneuver that transformed what was once a republic into something much darker, a dynasty with no expiration date. The silence of this moment was deafening, and it wouldn't be long before it shattered. 2 days later, on June 26, the streets of Lomé, Togo's capital, erupted, not with celebrations, but with rage. Tires were set ablaze, barricades were thrown up, and makeshift slogans sprayed in red, "You can't crown yourself king." The calm that had long characterized Lomé, known for its humid air and ocean breeze, suddenly gave way to an unmistakable feeling of collective outrage. This was no longer about politics as usual. What began in the shadows had ignited a spark that would turn Togo's streets into battlegrounds. The shift was swift, unnerving, and unlike anything seen before. The country's president had shifted Togo from a democracy to a dictatorship with a few strokes of the pen, and it felt like a betrayal of the people's trust. What made this moment even more intense was what followed, the sudden eruption of spontaneous protests. These were not coordinated by political parties, nor driven by any central leadership. The masses took to the streets, not just in Lomé, but in cities like Sokoto and Sevi. Young people, born under the rule of the Nasingbé family, now fully aware of the crushing weight of their legacy, were tired of watching their futures get stolen. The president had created a system that eliminated the possibility of change without ever needing to face the electorate again. By making the Council of Ministers the center of power, he stripped away any democratic checks and balances and made sure his family could maintain control indefinitely. This wasn't just a political maneuver, it was a complete power grab, one that threatened to undo all the progress the country had made in its struggle for democracy. But the people weren't ready to give up without a fight. On June 26, videos began circulating of protests breaking out across the city, as young men and women, their faces wrapped in scarves, hoisted signs that read, "We are not slaves," and 60 years of one name. The feeling of betrayal was palpable, and the anger that had been simmering for so long finally found its voice. The protests weren't just in Lomé, they were spreading across the country. Togo was trembling, and there was no denying that the people were ready to take on their government. But what made this moment especially volatile was what didn't happen. The regime didn't speak. There was no televised address from the president, no attempt to explain the reforms to the people, just silence. This vacuum of dialogue only deepened suspicions. Was this orchestrated behind closed doors? Were international powers complicit? What was happening in the parliament, and why was there no public discussion of such a radical change? The answers remained elusive, but the tension was rising. The government responded, not with words, but with force. Military trucks rolled through the streets, armored personnel carriers mounted with surveillance gear, and riot teams deployed to suppress the unrest. This wasn't about controlling a protest, this was about preventing a revolution from taking shape. The president's government wasn't just attempting to restore order, it was mobilizing to crush any dissent before it could spread beyond the capital. As the streets of Lomé were flooded with protesters, the government cracked down harder. In areas known for their opposition to the regime, like Bay, security forces conducted door-to-door raids. Protesters were dragged from their homes, their phones confiscated, and many beaten in front of their families. The violence wasn't just about quelling unrest, It was about instilling fear, and it seemed to be working. But while the boots were marching in the streets, the government was also waging a battle online. As the protests continued, Togo's government cut off the country's internet access. Mobile data, Wi-Fi, and social media platforms were blocked or severely restricted. The blackout was part of the regime's strategy to isolate the protesters from the outside world, to silence the voices that were now speaking up. But in the age of digital activism, the blackout only served to fuel the fire. Videos of the protests, despite the blackout, continued to circulate. People shared footage of the demonstrations with hashtags like #StopTheCouncil, #NotMyLeader, and #TogoRevolt, forcing the world to pay attention. As the internet went dark, the message from the streets grew louder. It wasn't just a political resistance, it was a cry for dignity, for the right to live in a nation where power could not be stolen by one family for generations. This wasn't just about one law, this was about taking back a nation that had been hijacked. The world watched as the president's grip on power began to slip. His military crackdown wasn't winning the people's hearts, it was exposing his deepest fear. The people no longer feared him, and that was more dangerous than any protest could be. As the protests grew, and the cries for democracy echoed across the streets of Lomé, one question loomed large: how far would the regime go to hold on to power? Would it crush the people underfoot, or would it listen to their demands and step down? The question wasn't just political, it was existential. The people had risen, and now they were ready to tear down the walls of oppression. The question remained, would Togo be enslaved by this new dynasty, or would the people be the ones to rise from the ashes of oppression and claim their freedom? As the flames of resistance in Togo burned hotter, the regime's response was swift and violent. On June 27, the first signs of real escalation became visible. The military wasn't just controlling crowds, they were seizing control of entire neighborhoods. Armored vehicles rolled through the streets of Lomé, and it wasn't just about putting down protests. The government was making a statement. This was no longer a matter of law enforcement, it was about total dominance. In neighborhoods like Bay, historically a center of anti-regime sentiment, security forces moved street by street, dragging citizens from their homes, seizing phones, and detaining anyone suspected of participating in the protests. Residents spoke of seeing parents beaten in front of their children, of people being dragged away without reason, of homes invaded by armed men in the early hours of the morning. It was a campaign of intimidation meant to paralyze the entire city, to make the people think twice before they dared to speak out again. The government wasn't just trying to suppress dissent, it was trying to break the spirit of the people. Yet, despite the brutality, the fire of rebellion continued to spread. Even in areas that had been politically dormant, like Sokode and Sevi, citizens gathered in defiance of the regime. What had begun as a protest in Lomé was now a nationwide uprising. The streets were alive with a sense of urgency, but the government's response only deepened the sense of betrayal. There was no attempt to explain the drastic reforms to the people. The president remained silent. The parliament's vote had changed the very fabric of Togo's political system, but the people weren't given a chance to weigh in. No referendum. No vote. Just a single decision that turned a republic into a monarchy. The people weren't going to stand by while their future was decided for them. But it wasn't just the people on the streets. The regime had to answer to the international community. As news of the crackdown spread, media outlets across the world began picking up the story. The images of military trucks in the streets, the videos of protesters being detained, and the silence from the government sent a clear message to the global community: Togo's democracy was slipping away. But it was also a message to the people within Togo's borders. This wasn't just about political opposition anymore. This was a fight for the soul of the nation. It was no longer about policy or law, it was about whether Togo would remain a republic, governed by the people, or whether it would become a kingdom controlled by the Nasingbé family. In the midst of this crisis, a new weapon emerged: digital activism. As the government clamped down on physical protests, it turned to the digital space to silence dissent. The internet, a lifeline for organizing and communicating, was severed. Togo experienced one of the most intense internet blackouts in recent history. Social media platforms, messaging apps, and even basic mobile data were crippled. But even in the absence of the internet, the protests found a way to continue. With the regime trying to silence communication, citizens used encrypted apps to share information and coordinate protests in secret. It became clear that the regime's greatest fear wasn't just the physical protests, it was the movement in the digital sphere. The blackout only fueled the anger of the people, turning their frustrations into a fight for their basic right to communicate, to organize, and to be heard. The people of Togo weren't just fighting for democracy, they were fighting for their dignity, for their right to exist as free citizens in their own country. And as the government attempted to silence them, it inadvertently amplified their message. What had started as a local uprising in Lomé was now a message to the entire world: Togo would no longer be ruled by a single family. The people would no longer be slaves to the system. The protest movements were no longer just about a single policy, they were about reclaiming the country from the hands of a family that had held it for too long. With each passing day, the anger grew, but so did the sense of hope. The protests weren't just about overthrowing a government. They were about giving the people their country back. They were about the power of the people to stand up against corruption, against tyranny, and against a system that had taken everything from them. But the government wasn't ready to give up. On the streets of Lomé, the military crackdown escalated. But the harder the government pushed back, the stronger the protests became. And as the battle for Togo's future unfolded on the streets, the world watched. This wasn't just Togo's fight. It was the fight of a generation, a fight that would have consequences for the entire region. If the people of Togo succeeded in reclaiming their democracy, it would send shockwaves across Africa. It would show that the power of the people could overcome even the most entrenched dictatorships. And so, the question remained, would Togo be enslaved by its rulers, or would the people rise up and reclaim their nation? The answer lay in the streets, in the hearts of the protesters who refused to back down. The future of Togo had not been decided yet. But one thing was certain, the battle for the soul of the nation had begun. As the crackdown in Togo escalated, the tension between the regime and the people grew increasingly palpable. On June 28, the government intensified its efforts to silence the protests. The streets of Lomé, once filled with defiant slogans and burning tires, became a scene of military occupation. Armored vehicles roamed the streets, checkpoints were set up at every corner, and the regime deployed even more troops to suppress the growing dissent. The government's strategy was clear. It wasn't just trying to control the protests, it was aiming to crush the spirit of the people. The response from the regime wasn't just about force. It was about intimidation. In neighborhoods where resistance was strongest, such as Bay, security forces conducted door-to-door raids. They weren't just looking for protest leaders, they were looking to instill fear in the population. People were pulled from their homes, phones were confiscated, and many were beaten in front of their families. The government's actions were calculated. The aim was not only to suppress the protests but to silence the will of the people for good. But as the government cracked down harder, the resolve of the protesters only seemed to grow stronger. The sense of betrayal that had ignited the protests was now being fueled by the brutality of the regime. Togo was no longer just witnessing political unrest. The country was witnessing the emergence of a nationwide movement for change, a movement that had united the people across cities, regions, and social classes. What had begun as a political response to one man's power grab was now a full-fledged rebellion against an entire political system. The protests had spread far beyond the capital. In cities like Sokode, Balim, and Sevi, people took to the streets in solidarity with Lomé. The protests weren't just a cry for change, they were a collective rejection of the Nasingbé dynasty that had ruled Togo for over 50 years. People were no longer just protesting one law, they were protesting a system that had been built to benefit a single family at the expense of the nation's people. The regime's response to this growing rebellion was nothing short of authoritarian. As the streets filled with protesters, the government enacted a communications blackout. On June 28, the internet was cut off across the country. What had once been a tool for organizing became a target for suppression. Social media platforms like Facebook, Twitter, WhatsApp, and Telegram went down. Mobile data, Wi-Fi, and SMS services were all severed. The government's message was clear: if you can't stop the people in the streets, then stop them from communicating. But even as the government sought to erase the protests from the digital world, the message continued to spread. Encrypted messaging apps became the new lifeline for protesters. People shared maps of safe routes, phone numbers for legal aid, and the latest news about the protests. Despite the government's best efforts to suppress communication, the protests continued to grow. The blackout didn't silence the people, it made their voices louder. As the government resorted to more violent tactics, the international community began to take notice. Satellite images showing the deployment of military units in Lomé and reports from human rights organizations highlighted the brutal response from the regime. Yet, despite the mounting evidence of state violence, the international response was muted. The European Union issued a brief statement calling for restraint, but there was no condemnation of the president's actions. The African Union remained diplomatically neutral, and France, Togo's longtime ally, offered vague comments about supporting stability in the region. The silence from the international community spoke volumes. It was clear that Togo's regime had the backing of powerful allies who prioritized stability over democracy. This only fueled the sense of betrayal among the people. They were not just fighting against their own government, they were fighting against a system that had allowed their suffering to continue for decades, with little accountability from the international community. The lack of action from Western powers only strengthened the resolve of the protesters. They were no longer asking for support from foreign governments. They were demanding the right to rule themselves. They were demanding dignity. But the question remained, how far was the government willing to go to maintain control? By June 29, the streets of Lomé were filled with the sound of gunfire. The regime's forces weren't just trying to control the crowd, they were trying to break it. Protesters who had once rallied together in unity now found themselves facing down heavily armed military forces. The atmosphere in the streets became increasingly tense as the regime unleashed its full force against its people. Despite the overwhelming violence, the protests did not subside. The people of Togo had reached a breaking point, and they were no longer afraid. They were no longer asking for permission to protest. They were demanding their future back. The question that now loomed large was whether the regime would be able to put down the uprising or whether the fire of resistance would spread across the entire nation. But one thing was certain, the protests had already ignited a spark that could not be extinguished. Togo's future was no longer in the hands of one family. It was in the hands of the people. By June 30th, the situation in Togo had reached a boiling point. The people were no longer just protesting a political maneuver. They were protesting the very foundation of the regime. The government's violence, the communications blackout, and the blatant disregard for the people's will had united the nation in a way that no politician or law could have predicted. The Nasingbé family, once untouchable, now found themselves facing a revolution born not from political opposition but from the raw fury of a people who had been silenced for too long. The protests had spread beyond Lomé, and the message was clear: Togo was ready for change. As the government attempted to suppress the movement with military force, the people fought back with resilience and determination. But what made this uprising different from past revolutions was its nature. It wasn't just about opposition parties leading the charge. This was a grassroots movement, driven by young people who had grown up under the oppressive rule of the Nasingbé dynasty. Many of them had never known a Togo without this family at the helm. Now, they were standing in defiance, no longer afraid of the regime's tactics. Their demands were simple: freedom, dignity, and a future where power was not concentrated in the hands of one family. The streets of Lomé, once peaceful and quiet, now echoed with the sound of chants and the fire of resistance. But as the protests intensified, so did the government's efforts to crush the uprising. On the night of June 30th, reports emerged of mass arrests. University students, teachers, and ordinary citizens were dragged from their homes and detained by security forces. The government had expanded its tactics from street-level suppression to systematic repression. Those who were seen as a threat to the regime, whether for participating in protests or merely voicing dissent, were targeted by the government's military forces. But even as Togo's security forces cracked down harder, the international community began to take notice. Human rights organizations condemned the regime's use of military force against its citizens, and the global media began to highlight the situation. Yet, despite this growing international attention, the government's response was unchanged. They continued to suppress the protests, hoping that with enough force, the uprising would eventually subside. But this time, the world wasn't turning a blind eye. As the international pressure mounted, the Togo regime found itself in an increasingly isolated position. The economic sanctions, the media spotlight, and the global calls for accountability were starting to chip away at the regime's credibility. But even as international forces made their voices heard, Togo's people were determined to fight on. The protests weren't slowing down. In fact, they were intensifying. The youth who had taken to the streets were more determined than ever to see their country free from the grip of the Nasingbé family. The protests weren't just about overthrowing a political system, they were about reclaiming the soul of Togo, about taking back their future from a family that had monopolized the country's destiny for far too long. As the days passed, the movement spread to rural areas, to towns and villages that had long been ignored by the government. In these areas, the revolution was no longer just about political reform. It was about survival. It was about the opportunity for a better life, one where the people were no longer relegated to second-class status. The demands for democracy had transformed into calls for justice. People were no longer asking for change, they were demanding it. And as the protests grew, so did the pressure on the government. The Nasingbé family had tried to consolidate their power through legal reforms, through military might, and through silencing the voices of the people. But no amount of force could erase the growing desire for freedom, no amount of repression could suppress the voices of a generation that had had enough. The revolution in Togo wasn't just a moment in time, it was a movement that had the potential to reshape the political landscape of Africa. The question that lingered now was simple: would the Nasingbé dynasty hold on to power through force, or would the people of Togo rise up and take back their future? As the protests continued to spread, the answer to that question was becoming clearer. The people had already won one battle. They had taken control of the streets, taken control of the narrative, and shown the world that they would not be silenced. But the real test was yet to come. Could they keep the fire of resistance burning, or would the regime's violence extinguish their hopes? The streets of Togo were still alive with the sound of rebellion, and the world was watching. The struggle for Togo's future was far from over. By July 1, 2025, Togo's political landscape had become a battlefield. The Nasingbé regime, once seen as unshakable, was now facing an unprecedented challenge. The protests, which had begun as a response to a single reform, had transformed into a nationwide uprising. What had started as discontent in Lomé was now a movement that spread across the entire country. The government's response was clear: escalate the violence, tighten the grip. But the more the regime pushed, the more the people pushed back. On the morning of July 1, the streets of Lomé were still filled with protesters, their chants echoing in the air. But the atmosphere had shifted. The government, no longer content with simply suppressing the protests, began to shift its strategy to one of complete military occupation. The streets of the capital were lined with armored personnel carriers. The sounds of helicopters and military trucks filled the air. This wasn't just about controlling a protest anymore, it was about taking control of the entire country, and the regime was willing to use any means necessary to maintain its grip on power. But this time, the people weren't afraid. In the face of tanks and riot police, the crowds didn't retreat. They stood firm. The streets were filled with a renewed sense of defiance. Protesters continued to chant, to wave their signs, to show the world that they would not be silenced. In response, the government brought in even more military units, tightening their hold on the city. People were detained in the streets, forced off buses, and dragged from their homes. The government was trying to quash the uprising by any means necessary. But despite the brutality, the protests only seemed to grow. Togo's youth, many of whom had grown up under the oppressive rule of the Nasingbé family, were now fully awakened. They were no longer afraid. They were no longer willing to live under a regime that had taken everything from them. The protests weren't just about the president anymore. They were about reclaiming the country from a family that had held power for too long. As the protests intensified, the international community began to take notice. Human rights groups condemned the regime's actions, calling for an end to the violence. The United Nations issued a statement, urging the government to respect the rights of its citizens. But while the world looked on, the Nasingbé regime showed no signs of backing down. In fact, they doubled down. The military was sent out in full force to stop the protests. They fired rubber bullets into crowds, fired tear gas, and made mass arrests. The internet remained shut down, isolating Togo from the rest of the world and making it harder for the protesters to organize. But in the age of digital resistance, the government's efforts to silence dissent had little effect. People continued to share their messages through encrypted apps, sending out videos of the protests to the outside world. And despite the government's best efforts to suppress the movement, the revolution continued to gain momentum. By the evening of July 1st, it was clear that the Nasingbé family's grip on power was slipping. The streets were still full of protesters, their numbers growing by the hour. The message from the streets was simple: the regime's time was up. The people had had enough, and they were not going to back down. The question now was not if the Nasingbé regime would fall, but when. The revolution had already begun, and the people of Togo were ready to see it through. The government's efforts to crush the uprising only revealed its desperation. It wasn't just a matter of losing control, it was a matter of losing legitimacy. The people no longer believed in the regime. They no longer feared it. And as the protests continued to spread across the country, it became clear that the Nasingbé dynasty could no longer hold on to power. The people were taking back their future. The revolution was no longer just a dream, it was a reality, and Togo was on the verge of change. The world would be watching closely to see how far the people would go and how far the regime was willing to push back. The answer to that question would define Togo's future, and it was still uncertain. But one thing was clear: the fight for Togo's future was far from over. As Togo's rebellion spread across the nation, the stakes grew higher by the day. The government's response to the protests became more ruthless, and yet the people's resolve only grew stronger. By July 2nd, the streets of Lomé and other cities across Togo were filled with the voices of citizens determined to reclaim their country. The government had resorted to using the full force of its military to control the situation, but the people were not backing down. The government's tactics had shifted from mere suppression to total occupation. The military was now conducting mass arrests, rounding up anyone suspected of being involved in the protests. Citizens were detained without cause, and entire neighborhoods were under curfew. Despite this, the people continued to resist. They knew that the fight wasn't just about a single law or policy, it was about the very future of their country. As the military's presence increased, so did the intensity of the protests. In the early hours of July 2nd, a new wave of demonstrators took to the streets. This time, they weren't just protesting against the Nasingbé dynasty, they were protesting against the culture of fear and oppression that had been embedded in Togo for decades. Young people who had never known life without the Nasingbé family's control were leading the charge. They were fighting not only for democracy but for the freedom to shape their own future, free from the oppressive shadow of the ruling family. The regime's strategy had backfired. Instead of quelling the uprising, it had sparked a fire that was spreading across the country. By the evening of July 2nd, the streets of Lomé were a battleground. The government had tried to silence the people by cutting off communication, using military force, and imposing a curfew. But none of that stopped the protests. In fact, it only fueled the anger and frustration of the people. Every act of violence by the regime seemed to make the protesters more determined. What had begun as a response to a single political move had now become a full-fledged revolution. The people of Togo were no longer asking for change, they were demanding it. In the midst of the chaos, the international community began to take notice. News outlets around the world were reporting on the protests and the government's violent response. Human rights organizations condemned the regime's actions, and many foreign governments expressed concern about the escalating situation. But despite the international attention, the Nasingbé family seemed undeterred. They continued to defend their actions, framing the protests as a threat to national security. The government was willing to sacrifice the country's future in order to hold on to power. But this didn't sit well with the people. The more the regime tried to paint the protests as a threat, the more the people stood firm in their resolve. The revolution wasn't about fear. It was about hope. The people of Togo were tired of living under a regime that had ruled with an iron fist for generations. They were tired of a political system that put power in the hands of one family, blocking any chance for true democracy. And now, they were determined to change it. By July 3rd, the momentum of the protests was undeniable. The streets were filled with people of all ages, students, workers, teachers, parents, united by a common cause. The regime, once so secure in its power, was now on the defensive. It was no longer just a matter of controlling the protests, it was about maintaining the illusion of legitimacy. The cracks in the regime's facade were starting to show. The people had risen, and the world was watching. The future of Togo was being decided in the streets, not in the halls of power. The protests were no longer just about overthrowing the Nasingbé dynasty. They were about reclaiming the country's future, about showing that the people's will could not be ignored. The question now was simple: how much longer could the regime hold on? The people of Togo had already shown they would not back down. They had shown they were willing to fight for their future. And now, the world had to wait and see whether the Nasingbé family would be able to cling to power, or whether the people would finally take back their country. By July 4, 2025, the tension in Togo had reached its peak. The people were no longer just protesting, they were leading a movement, a revolution that had taken root not just in Lomé, but across the entire country. As the days went by, it became clear that the Nasingbé regime could no longer rely on force alone to maintain control. The people's resistance had grown too strong, too widespread, and the cracks in the regime's power were becoming more apparent. Despite the military's presence, despite the curfews and mass arrests, the streets continued to be filled with protesters. Young and old, urban and rural, the people of Togo had united in their demand for change. And the more the regime tried to suppress them, the more the resistance grew. But the stakes were higher than just Togo's future. The political upheaval in the small West African country had set off alarm bells across the region. The Nasingbé dynasty, which had held power for over half a century, was facing a challenge unlike anything it had seen before. And now, the whole of West Africa was watching closely. The regime's brutal tactics were beginning to attract the attention of neighboring countries, many of which had long been ruled by authoritarian regimes themselves. Leaders in countries like Benin, Côte d'Ivoire, and Cameroon were beginning to feel the pressure. They saw in Togo's protests a mirror of their own fragile political systems. What happened in Togo could easily happen in their own countries. As the people of Togo continued to fight, the international community, once hesitant, began to take more decisive action. Diplomatic pressure on the Nasingbé regime intensified. Governments across Africa and beyond began to condemn the violence against protesters and demand that the government engage in dialogue. The United Nations and the European Union called for an immediate end to the crackdown and for the regime to respect the rights of its citizens. The international media began to amplify the voices of the protesters, broadcasting their messages to the world. But while the regime was facing mounting international pressure, it seemed to double down on its oppressive tactics. As the government attempted to cling to power, it was losing control of the narrative. The people of Togo had already taken back their voice, and they weren't going to let it be silenced again. What made the protests so powerful was that they were not led by political parties or organized groups, they were led by ordinary citizens, united by a common goal. People who had never been politically active were now at the forefront of the movement, organizing protests, coordinating efforts through encrypted messaging apps, and using social media to spread the message. Togo's young people, many of whom had grown up under the Nasingbé family's rule, were driving this revolution. They had lived through years of political stagnation, corruption, and economic paralysis, and they were no longer willing to accept the status quo. This was a generation that had grown up with access to the internet, with knowledge of how other countries had fought for their freedoms, and they were determined to take action. By July 5, the movement had reached a tipping point. The streets of Lomé were filled with thousands of people, their voices rising in unison, demanding an end to the Nasingbé dynasty. The protests were no longer just about removing one leader. They were about dismantling an entire political system that had held power for far too long. The government's attempts to suppress the movement had failed. The people of Togo had already shown that they would not back down, and now the pressure was mounting on the Nasingbé regime. The world was watching. The question now was whether the regime would be able to maintain its hold on power, or whether the people would succeed in reclaiming their future. Togo's revolution was no longer just a domestic affair, it had become a symbol of hope for people across Africa. The struggle for freedom in Togo had sparked a broader conversation about democracy, accountability, and the rights of the people. The Nasingbé regime, once thought to be unshakable, was now facing the greatest challenge in its history. And the world waited to see whether the people of Togo could succeed in taking back their country from the grip of one family, or whether the regime would crush the rebellion and maintain its grip on power. One thing was certain, the fight for Togo's future was far from over, and the people were ready to fight for the freedom they had been denied for so long. By July 6, 2025, the struggle in Togo had reached its most critical juncture. The people, having fought for their freedom for over a week, were now at a breaking point. The streets were filled with protesters, young and old, from every corner of Togo. The Nasingbé regime, which had once believed its power to be unshakable, now found itself on the verge of collapse. The military, despite its heavy presence, could not suppress the swelling tide of resistance. The people had shown resilience in the face of brutality, and their resolve was unbroken. What had started as a political reform to cement a family's hold on power had spiraled into a nationwide revolution. The Nasingbé family's attempt to transform Togo from a democracy into a dynasty had backfired. As the days passed, the regime's methods grew harsher. The military crackdown intensified, with more mass arrests, more raids, and more violence. Yet, despite the government's best efforts to quash the rebellion, the people of Togo continued to rise. They stood tall in defiance of a regime that had stolen their future and their dignity. The protests had reached a point of no return. They were no longer just a reaction to one man's power grab, they had become a symbol of resistance against a political dynasty that had ruled for over 50 years. The Nasingbé family had underestimated the power of the people, the power of the youth, and the power of unity. As the streets filled with thousands of voices chanting for freedom, the question that lingered in the air was no longer whether the regime would fall, but how soon. International pressure had mounted. Diplomatic efforts to engage the Togo government had failed. The United Nations, the European Union, and other global organizations had condemned the violence, but the government had refused to back down. Instead, they continued to pour more resources into suppressing the uprising, but the more they pushed, the stronger the resistance became. It became clear that the Togo government was losing legitimacy, not only in the eyes of its people but also in the eyes of the world. The international community had spoken out, but the Togo regime, despite its isolation, held firm. The protests, however, were no longer just about taking down a single leader. They were about taking down an entire system. It wasn't just about President Nasingbé, it was about the entire political structure that had allowed the Nasingbé family to rule without challenge for decades. The regime's attempts to suppress the protests only revealed its weakness. The people had already begun to reclaim the streets, and no amount of violence or oppression could stop them. With every passing day, the protests spread further, and the streets of Togo became increasingly filled with people demanding change. They weren't afraid anymore. They had nothing left to lose. And the government, despite its military strength, could no longer contain the growing tide of resistance. By July 7th, Togo's future was hanging in the balance. The country was on the verge of something monumental, something that could reshape the entire political landscape of the region. The protests had turned into a full-scale revolution, and the Nasingbé family was now fighting to keep its grip on power, but the question was whether they would succeed. The people's resolve was clear, and it was stronger than ever. They had already made it clear, they would no longer be ruled by one family. They would not allow their country to become a dynastic monarchy. The regime, once confident in its control, was now faced with the reality that the people would not go quietly into the night. This was their revolution, and they were willing to fight for it. The world was watching. The Nasingbé family had brought Togo to the edge of a precipice, and now, only time would tell whether the people could seize their future. Would Togo's revolution succeed in reclaiming the country for its people, or would the regime's brutal force snuff out the flame of hope? The final battle for Togo's freedom was about to unfold, and the future of the country was uncertain. But one thing was clear: Togo had become a symbol of defiance against tyranny, a symbol that would inspire nations around the world. The people of Togo had stood up. And now, the world was waiting to see if they would win their freedom.